This story isn't one I tell often. It's not because I don't remember it, on the contrary, I remember every single detail, as if it happened yesterday. It's the kind of experience that stays with you, no matter how much you want to forget. 2 years ago, I decided to take a camping trip. I'd been working long hours in the city, surrounded by noise, people, and endless distractions. I thought a weekend alone in nature would be the perfect escape. Just me, my thoughts, and the peace and quiet of the wilderness. I had no idea how wrong I was. I chose a spot deep in the forest, far from any towns or marked trails. It wasn't one of those popular campsites you see in brochures. This was true wilderness, untouched and isolated. I found it by poring over maps online, looking for somewhere off the beaten path. The kind of place where you wouldn't see another person for miles. I packed everything I thought I'd need, a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, food, water, and my trusty flashlight. Before I left, I made sure to tell a friend where I was going, just in case. I laughed when they called me brave for heading out there alone. At the time, it felt like an adventure. Now, I wonder if that was the first mistake. The drive out was uneventful at first. Long stretches of highway gave way to narrow roads, and soon I was navigating dirt paths that twisted through dense trees. The deeper I went, the more the world seemed to close in around me. There was something about the stillness of the forest. No houses, no cell towers, no signs of modern life. Just trees, endless trees. As the sun began to set, I finally reached the spot I had marked on my map. It was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. A faint trail led down to a stream nearby, and the air smelled fresh, clean. For a moment, I felt exactly what I'd hoped for, peace. Setting up camp didn't take long. I pitched my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and ate a quick dinner. By the time night fell, the temperature had dropped, and the forest was pitch black. I remember staring into the fire, listening to the crackle of the wood. The silence was overwhelming. You don't realize how much noise we live with every day until it's gone. But as I sat there, I started to notice something. The silence wasn't constant. Every so often, there was a sound. A rustle in the leaves. A faint snap of a twig. Nothing unusual for a forest, I told myself. Probably a deer or some other animal moving through the trees. But still, I felt uneasy. I told myself I was just adjusting to being alone. That's what I wanted, wasn't it? To escape the chaos and noise of everyday life. And yet, as the hours stretched on, I found myself listening more closely. Waiting for the next sound. At one point, I thought I heard whispering. Faint, almost like the wind passing through the trees, but different. I shook it off, convinced it was my imagination. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone. Eventually, I decided to turn in for the night. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was completely dark. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. I remember thinking how strange it was, how dark and quiet the world could be. But just as I started to drift off, I heard it. A sound. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Moving through the leaves, just outside my tent. I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest. I told myself it had to be an animal, but the sound was wrong. Too heavy. Too steady. It was the sound of someone walking. Someone, or something. The footsteps stopped, right next to my tent. And that was only the beginning. If you've made it this far, I can promise you, the story only gets stranger. What happened next is something I've struggled to make sense of ever since. But before we go on, take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are stories out there you wouldn't believe, and this is just one of them. Let me tell you what happened next. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for what felt like an eternity. I just lay there, listening. The footsteps, whatever had been making them, had stopped right outside my tent. I couldn't see anything, the walls of the tent felt paper-thin, like they offered no protection at all. And the silence, it was louder than anything I've ever experienced. My pulse was in my ears, drowning out everything else, but I swear I heard something, breathing. Slow. Steady. Just outside. I told myself to stay calm. It's just an animal, I thought. It has to be. A bear, maybe. Or a deer. But deep down, I knew. I knew this wasn't an animal. I don't know how I knew, but I did. Minutes passed, at least, I think they were minutes. Time felt strange in that moment, stretching out endlessly. And then, the breathing stopped. Just like that. I waited, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling. Just the sound of my own shaky breaths. Whatever had been out there was gone. Or so I thought. When I finally worked up the courage, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the clearing. It looked exactly the same as it had when I set up camp, completely still, untouched. No sign of anyone, or anything, around. I scanned the area, over and over, convinced I'd see a shadow or a figure lurking in the trees. But there was nothing. I told myself I must have imagined it. Maybe it was the wind, or my mind playing tricks on me. I was in the middle of nowhere, after all, completely alone. Maybe I just wasn't used to the silence. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The next morning, I woke up early. I didn't sleep much after what happened, but I must have drifted off at some point. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows through the trees. I stepped out of the tent, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. The air was cold, crisp, and for a moment, I let myself enjoy the quiet beauty of the forest. But then I saw them. Footprints. Clear, unmistakable footprints in the dirt around my tent. They weren't mine. I could tell by the size and the shape. They were larger, wider, and barefoot. They circled the tent, weaving in and out between the trees. My stomach turned as I followed them, my flashlight trembling in my hand. They led away from the clearing, deeper into the forest, and then, they just stopped. No trail, no sign of where they went. They simply ended. I stood there for a long time, staring at that last print. The ground was soft, damp from the morning dew. There was no way someone could have walked here without leaving more tracks. And yet, there was nothing. I scanned the trees, half expecting to see someone watching me, but the woods were empty. Or at least, they looked that way. I decided to push the thought out of my mind. Maybe the tracks had been there before I arrived, and I just hadn't noticed. That had to be it, right? So, I packed up a small bag and decided to explore the area. Maybe I'd find some answers, or at least something to take my mind off things. The forest was beautiful, I'll give it that. Towering trees, sunlight filtering through the leaves, and the sound of a stream trickling in the distance. For a while, I actually felt calm. I followed the sound of the water and found a small stream winding its way through the trees. It was shallow, clear, the kind of place that felt untouched by the modern world. But then I saw something that made me stop. At first, I didn't even realize what I was looking at. Just a pile of rocks stacked in a strange pattern near the edge of the water. 5 stones, balanced precariously on top of each other, like some kind of marker. It didn't look natural. Someone had put them there, but why? I looked around, scanning the area, but again, there was no one. Just me and the sound of the stream. I didn't touch the stones. Something about them made my skin crawl. Instead, I kept walking, heading further upstream. That's when I noticed something else. Scratches on the trees. Long, deep gouges, as if something with claws had raked its way through the forest. The marks were uneven, jagged, and there were dozens of them, all on trees in a straight line. I followed them, heart pounding with every step. I told myself I'd turn back if I found anything worse. And then I found it. A campsite. Or what was left of one. A torn tent, its fabric shredded and flapping in the breeze. Scattered belongings, an old backpack, a rusted lantern, a pair of boots. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just the state of the camp. It was the way it felt, standing there. Like I was intruding. Like I wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't stay long. I took one last look around, then turned and headed back to my own camp. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe someone had camped there a long time ago and left in a hurry. Maybe the scratches on the trees were from animals. Maybe the stones by the stream were just a coincidence. But as I walked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jump. I started walking faster, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. By the time I reached my campsite, I was practically running. It was only the first day. And already, I was beginning to regret coming here. But what I didn't realize was that this was only the beginning. Whatever was out there in those woods, it wasn't done with me yet. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept replaying everything I'd seen, the footprints, the stacked stones, the scratches on the trees, and that abandoned campsite. I tried telling myself it didn't matter, that I was just overthinking things, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't convince myself. The air around me felt different, heavier somehow, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting. As the sun started to set, I found myself rushing to prepare. I gathered more firewood than I thought I'd need, built up the fire until the flames danced higher than they had the night before, and double-checked my tent, as if tightening the straps would make it safer. It was strange, I'd been camping plenty of times before, but this felt different. This time, I wasn't just keeping animals out. I was keeping something out. The darkness fell fast, swallowing up the last light of day in what felt like an instant. I stayed close to the fire, listening to the crackle of the wood and the occasional pop of sparks. At first, it felt almost comforting, like the fire was the only thing standing between me and the creeping blackness of the forest. But the longer I sat there, the more I became aware of the sounds around me. They were faint at first. A rustling in the bushes, the distant snap of a twig. I tried telling myself it was just animals, but the sounds didn't come from one place, they came from all around me. One moment, I'd hear something behind me. The next, it would come from the trees to my left. Then, from the right. It was as if the forest itself was alive, moving, shifting, watching. And then, the noises stopped. Not just the rustling or the snapping twigs. Everything stopped. The wind, the insects, even the distant sound of the stream. It was like someone had flipped a switch and turned off the entire forest. I sat there, staring into the fire, my ears straining to catch any sound, any movement. But there was nothing. Just silence. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. And then, just when I started to think the silence would never end, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the leaves just beyond the light of the fire. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it around, pointing it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks and branches, but I didn't see anything. The footsteps stopped as soon as I moved the light. I scanned the area, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. No movement, no shadows. Just trees. I told myself to calm down. It's nothing, I thought. Probably a raccoon or some other animal. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They were too slow, too heavy, too deliberate. I turned back toward the fire, trying to shake the feeling of eyes on me. And that's when I heard it again. The sound of breathing. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there. Slow, steady breaths, coming from just beyond the edge of the firelight. My hands were shaking as I shone the flashlight toward the sound, but again, there was nothing there. The breathing stopped the moment the light hit the trees. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was just hearing things, but deep down, I knew. I wasn't alone. I couldn't stay by the fire any longer. The light, the open space, it didn't feel safe. I scrambled into my tent, zipping it closed behind me, as if that thin layer of fabric would protect me from whatever was out there. I lay there in my sleeping bag, clutching the flashlight like a weapon, listening to every sound outside. For a while, there was nothing. Just the crackle of the fire and my own shaky breaths. And then, the footsteps came back. This time, they were closer. I could hear them circling the tent, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves. They'd stop for a moment, then start again, moving to another side of the tent. I lay there, frozen, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. I wanted to look, to shine my flashlight through the thin walls of the tent, but I couldn't bring myself to move. All I could do was listen. The footsteps stopped again, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, out of nowhere, the tent shook. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal brushing past. It was deliberate. Something, or someone, grabbed the fabric of the tent and shook it. Hard. I scrambled to my knees, fumbling with the flashlight, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold it. I shone the light at the walls of the tent, but all I could see was the fabric. No shadows, no shapes. Just the light reflecting off the nylon. I shouted, hoping to scare off whatever was out there. My voice came out shaky and weak, but I didn't care. I yelled as loud as I could, hoping that whatever was out there would leave me alone. And for a moment, it worked. The shaking stopped, and the footsteps retreated into the trees. But I didn't sleep that night. I sat there in the tent, clutching the flashlight, jumping at every sound. The footsteps didn't come back, but the silence was worse somehow. I felt like I was being watched, like the forest itself was staring at me, waiting for me to let my guard down. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I stepped out of the tent, exhausted and on edge. The fire had burned down to ash, and the clearing looked exactly as it had the day before. But I knew something had changed. Whatever had been out there last night, it wasn't gone. And I had a feeling it wasn't going to leave me alone. I should have packed up and left right then. I should have driven away and never looked back. But I didn't. I told myself I was overreacting, that I was just tired and paranoid. I convinced myself to stay one more night. That was my second mistake. The morning passed in a haze. I tried to shake off the fear from the night before, but it clung to me like a shadow. I kept glancing over my shoulder, listening for sounds that weren't there, scanning the trees for movement. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore, it felt wrong. Like it was hiding something just out of sight. But I told myself I was being ridiculous. People camp in the woods all the time, right? Weird sounds, strange feelings, they're just part of the experience. I tried to focus on the little tasks to keep myself busy, fetching water from the stream, gathering more firewood, checking my gear. Anything to keep my mind occupied. That's when I found it. I was walking along the edge of the clearing, looking for more wood for the fire, when I saw something hanging from one of the trees. At first, I thought it was just a branch, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a bundle of sticks, tied together with what looked like hair. Human hair. It dangled from a low branch, swaying slightly in the breeze. My stomach turned. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Who would make something like this? And why? I reached out to touch it, but the moment my fingers brushed against the rough surface of the sticks, a chill ran down my spine. I pulled my hand back, suddenly sure that I shouldn't be anywhere near it. I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me, but the forest was as still and empty as ever. At least, that's what I told myself. I went back to my camp, trying to push the image out of my mind. But the more I tried not to think about it, the more it stuck with me. That bundle of sticks, tied with hair, it felt like a warning. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew better. Someone, or something, had left it there. And they wanted me to find it. I should have left. I should have packed up my gear and gotten as far away from that place as I could. But I didn't. I convinced myself to stay, just one more night. I told myself I was overreacting. That whatever was happening, it couldn't hurt me. I was wrong. That afternoon, I decided to explore again. Maybe I was hoping to find something that would explain the strange things I'd seen. Or maybe I just didn't want to sit around the campsite, waiting for the night to fall. Either way, I grabbed my flashlight and headed deeper into the woods. The forest felt different as I walked. The trees seemed closer together, the shadows darker, the air heavier. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but that didn't stop the unease from crawling up my spine. Every now and then, I'd hear something, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Then, I found the clearing. It was small, surrounded by tall trees, and the ground was covered in dead leaves. But what caught my attention wasn't the clearing itself, it was what was in the center of it. A circle of stones, arranged with almost perfect precision. In the middle of the circle was something that looked like ashes. As if someone had built a fire there, but not recently. The stones were blackened, and the smell of burnt wood still lingered in the air. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt colder here, the silence even deeper. I crouched down, examining the stones and the ashes. They didn't look old, but they didn't look fresh either. It was as if the fire had burned itself out long ago, but the traces of it refused to fade. And then I saw them. Symbols. Carved into the stones. Strange, jagged lines that didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. They crisscrossed each other, forming patterns that didn't make sense. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the rough grooves, and the moment I touched them, a wave of dizziness washed over me. I stumbled back, shaking my head, trying to clear the sudden fog in my mind. I left the clearing as fast as I could, my heart racing. I told myself I'd had enough exploring for one day. But as I made my way back to camp, the forest felt different. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, a sense that something was watching me. But the further I walked, the stronger it got. By the time I reached the campsite, I was practically running. When I got back, I realized something was wrong. The firewood I'd gathered earlier was gone. Not scattered or moved, gone. My tent was still there, untouched, but the pile of wood I'd stacked next to it was nowhere to be seen. I looked around, searching the clearing, but it was as if it had just vanished. That's when I saw the footprints again. They weren't mine. They were larger, wider, and they circled the campsite just like before. But this time, they didn't stop at the edge of the clearing. They led directly to my tent. And then, they stopped. Right at the entrance. I froze, staring at the prints. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How could someone, or something, have been here while I was gone? And where had they gone? The tracks didn't lead away from the tent. They just ended. I stayed close to the fire that evening, watching the shadows dance in the flickering light. Every now and then, I'd hear something in the woods, a distant rustle, a faint crack of a branch. I told myself it was just the wind. Just animals. But I knew better. I could feel it, deep in my gut. I wasn't alone out there. That night, as the fire burned low and the darkness closed in, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there in those woods, it was getting closer. The fire was my only comfort. I kept adding more wood to keep it going, even as the flames began to sputter against the damp air. I told myself I'd be fine as long as I stayed by the light. But deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it. There was something about the darkness of that forest, it felt alive, like it was pressing in from all sides, waiting for me to make a mistake. The sound started again, just like the night before. Rustling in the bushes, twigs snapping in the distance. But this time, they were louder. Closer. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees, but the light didn't seem to reach as far as it should have. The forest felt, deeper somehow, like the trees had moved closer while I wasn't looking. I stood there, scanning the shadows, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight steady. And then, just as suddenly as the noises had started, they stopped. The forest fell silent again. Completely, utterly silent. I turned back to the fire, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind, or some animal passing through. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My bag, where I'd kept my food and supplies, was open. I hadn't touched it since I got back to camp, but now it was sitting wide open, the contents spilled across the ground. And there, lying next to it, was something I hadn't packed. It was a small wooden carving. Roughly shaped, like it had been whittled with a dull knife. It looked like a figure, human, but distorted. The arms were too long, the legs too thin, and the face was blank. Smooth. No features at all. Just an empty oval of wood staring back at me. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to throw it into the fire, to destroy it, but something stopped me. A feeling I couldn't explain. It was like the carving was watching me, even without eyes. Like it was waiting to see what I would do. I grabbed a piece of cloth from my bag and wrapped it around the carving, shoving it into a corner of the tent where I wouldn't have to look at it. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, staring at me from the darkness. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I sat by the fire, jumping at every sound, every shadow. I didn't dare go back into the tent. The thought of lying there, vulnerable, with that thing in the corner, was too much. So I stayed outside, staring into the flames, trying to keep myself awake. But at some point, exhaustion got the better of me. I don't know how long I was asleep. An hour, maybe 2. But when I woke up, the fire was almost out, and the clearing was darker than ever. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger as I sat there, trying to shake off the grogginess. It was a rancid, metallic smell, like blood mixed with decay. My stomach churned, and I clapped a hand over my nose, but the stench was everywhere. It was suffocating. Then I heard it. A sound I'll never forget. It started as a low, guttural growl, barely audible over the pounding of my own heartbeat. But it grew louder, deeper, until it echoed through the clearing. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It was too deep, too unnatural. It sounded wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. I grabbed my flashlight and spun around, shining it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't show anything. No movement, no shapes, just the endless black of the forest. But the growling didn't stop. It was circling me, moving from one side of the clearing to the other, faster than anything should have been able to move. I stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Just for a second, barely more than a flicker. A shape, darting between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs were wrong. Too long, too thin, moving in a way that didn't make sense. My flashlight swung toward it, but by the time the beam hit, it was gone. The growling stopped as suddenly as it had started. The silence that followed was almost worse. I felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, without warning, the fire exploded back to life. The flames shot up, higher than they should have been able to, lighting up the clearing in an instant. And there, at the edge of the light, was a figure. It was standing perfectly still, just beyond the reach of the flames. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, and its arms hung at an unnatural angle. For a moment, neither of us moved. I just stood there, staring at it, and it stared back. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. 1 second it was there, and the next, the clearing was empty again. I didn't sleep after that. I didn't even try. I sat by the fire, keeping it as high as I could, waiting for the first light of dawn. And when the sun finally broke through the trees, I didn't waste a second. I packed up my gear, grabbed my bag, and left that place behind. I didn't care about the footprints, or the carving, or the smell. I just wanted to get out of those woods. But even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have, and every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I thought I'd made it out. I thought I was safe. But I was wrong. What happened after I left the woods was worse than anything I experienced inside them. I thought once I was out, I'd be safe. That as long as I put distance between myself and those woods, whatever had been out there would leave me alone. But I was wrong. I didn't realize it at first. The drive home was quiet, uneventful. The sun was shining, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. But even then, something felt off. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, or someone, behind me. The road was empty, though. Just long stretches of highway and endless trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That something had followed me. When I got home, everything felt normal. Too normal, almost. My house, my neighborhood, it all looked exactly the way I'd left it. But it didn't feel right. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of wrongness that I couldn't explain. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just tired, that I'd feel better after some rest. That night, I went to bed early. I thought I'd sleep like a rock after everything I'd been through, but instead, I lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, made my heart race. I felt like a child again, afraid of the dark for reasons I couldn't name. And then, I heard it. It was faint at first. A tapping sound, coming from somewhere in the house. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat, and listened. The tapping came again, louder this time. It was steady, deliberate, like someone knocking softly on the wall. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling, or a branch brushing against the window. But as I sat there, straining to hear, the tapping grew louder. Closer. I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight, and slowly got out of bed. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The tapping didn't stop. It led me down the hall, toward the living room. I hesitated at the doorway, shining the light into the darkness. Everything looked normal. The furniture was where I'd left it, the windows were shut, and the door was locked. But the tapping continued. It was coming from the front door. I stood there, frozen, staring at the door. The sound was so loud now, echoing through the quiet house. I wanted to open it, to see what was on the other side, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Something about it felt wrong. I took a step back, and the tapping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. And then, a voice. It was low, almost a whisper, but clear enough that I could hear every word. "Let me in." I stumbled back, my hands trembling, the flashlight beam shaking as I pointed it toward the door. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting. The voice came again, softer this time. "Please, let me in." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there, but my body wouldn't listen. I felt like I was rooted to the spot, like something was holding me there, forcing me to listen. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The tapping stopped. The house fell silent again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the living room, clutching my phone, waiting for the sun to rise. When it finally did, I checked the door, half expecting to find scratches or footprints or some other sign that someone, or something, had been there. But there was nothing. No marks, no signs of forced entry. Just the quiet, empty front porch. I told myself it was over, that whatever had followed me was gone. But deep down, I knew better. The next few days were strange. Things started happening that I couldn't explain. I'd wake up in the morning to find doors open that I was sure I'd closed. Objects would move, just small things, like a book on the table or a cup in the kitchen. I'd hear faint whispers at night, just on the edge of hearing, like someone was speaking in the next room. But when I checked, there was no one there. And then, I found it. The carving. The same wooden figure I'd found in the woods, the one I'd left behind in the tent. It was sitting on my nightstand, right next to my bed. I stared at it, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How could it be here? I'd left it behind, I was sure of it. And yet, there it was, exactly as I remembered it. The blank, featureless face seemed to be staring at me, watching me. I grabbed it, intending to throw it away, but the moment my fingers touched the wood, a wave of nausea washed over me. I dropped it, stumbling back, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye. A shadow, darting across the room. That was when I realized the truth. Whatever was in those woods hadn't stayed there. It had followed me home. I don't know what it wants. I don't know why it chose me. But I know one thing for sure. It's still here. Even now, as I sit here telling you this story, I can feel it watching me. Waiting. If you ever find yourself in the middle of nowhere, alone in the woods, and you feel like something is watching you, listen to that feeling. Trust it. And whatever you do, don't bring anything back with you. I wish I had. I thought I could live with it. That if I ignored the carving, ignored the whispers, ignored the shadows, it would stop. That it would go away. But it didn't. The things I tried to convince myself were coincidences became impossible to ignore. It started small. Lights flickering, the smell of something burning that would vanish as quickly as it appeared. I'd hear knocking at odd hours, on the walls, on the doors, sometimes even on the windows. Always slow, deliberate, like someone was testing to see if I'd answer. At first, I convinced myself it was just the house settling, or the pipes, or the wind. But then I saw it. I was sitting in the living room late one night, too scared to sleep, when I felt it. That same feeling I'd had in the woods. The sense of being watched. My eyes darted around the room, scanning the shadows, and that's when I noticed it. A figure. Standing just beyond the doorway, where the light didn't quite reach. It wasn't moving. Just standing there, perfectly still. I couldn't make out its features, if it even had any. But I knew it was the same thing I'd seen in the forest. The same thing that had followed me home. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, neither of us moved. I wanted to look away, to run, to scream, but I couldn't. It was like my body had been paralyzed by its gaze. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Just, gone. Like it had never been there at all. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching a flashlight in one hand and a knife in the other, waiting for it to come back. But it didn't. Not that night, anyway. The next morning, I tried to tell myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. It wasn't just in the house. It was everywhere. I started seeing it during the day. Out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving, a shadow darting across the room. I'd hear footsteps upstairs when I knew I was alone. I even started hearing my name, whispered so faintly I almost wasn't sure I'd heard it at all. But the worst part was the carving. No matter what I did, it kept coming back. I tried throwing it away. I drove to the edge of town and left it in a dumpster, thinking that would be the end of it. But the next morning, it was sitting on my kitchen table, right where I'd left it the first time I found it. I tried burning it, smashing it, even burying it in the backyard, but it didn't matter. Every time, it came back. Always in the same spot. Always watching. I started to lose track of time. The days blended together, and the nights were worse. I stopped sleeping altogether, too afraid of what I might see if I closed my eyes. My friends stopped calling, my work started piling up, but I didn't care. Nothing seemed to matter anymore. All I could think about was that figure. The way it moved, the way it watched me, the way it seemed to grow closer every time I saw it. I thought about leaving. About packing up and moving to another town, another state, anywhere but here. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't tied to the house. It was tied to me. And then, one night, everything changed. I woke up to the sound of knocking. Not on the door, not on the walls. On my bedroom window. My heart stopped. I live on the second floor. There's no balcony, no tree, nothing that could explain how someone, or something, could be outside my window. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. But something compelled me to. Slowly, I turned my head, my breath caught in my throat. And there it was. The figure. Standing outside my window, staring in. Its face, or what should have been its face, was pressed against the glass. Blank, featureless, but somehow still, staring. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch as it raised one long, spindly hand and tapped on the glass. Once. Twice. 3 times. And then, it was gone. That was the moment I knew there was no escaping it. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop. Not until it got what it wanted. And the truth is, I still don't know what that is. It doesn't speak. It doesn't show itself for long. It just watches. Waits. And every day, it feels like it's getting closer. I don't know how much longer I can take this. I don't know what will happen when it finally reaches me. But if you're listening to this, if you've made it this far, please, take this as a warning. If you ever find yourself in a place that feels wrong, that feels empty, don't ignore it. Don't stay. And whatever you do, don't bring anything back with you. Because if you do, it won't just follow you. It will never let you go. And if you ever hear a knock at your window, don't look. Thank you for listening. If you've ever experienced anything like this, or if you have a story of your own, let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Stay safe out there. You never know what's watching.